Careful, he sneered. Wearing a suit but not working, standing outside a closed bookstore? Looks like you've got something to hide. Fake intellectual, stand up, turn around, and minutes later the regret hit him. Not because he didn't know who the man was, but because he was so sure someone like him couldn't be anyone at all. Where you live, how many people get treated like criminals just because they don't carry power in their pocket? Under the rare sunlight of a slow afternoon, Martin Hayes stood in front of a small, shuttered bookstore. An old sign hung quietly above the dusty glass window, where neatly arranged books once sat, now reflecting only his silhouette. A tailored black suit, crisp white shirt, black tie with no label, and polished leather shoes made him stand out. The street was calm, with manicured trees and white-painted houses lining both sides. Everything seemed to belong to its quiet order. Everything except him. Martin did not check his watch. He was in no rush. His arms hung relaxed, his right hand holding an old book with a faded cover and no visible title. He had been standing there for nearly 10 minutes, as if waiting for something that wasn't in his plans. A few cars passed without slowing down, music drifting out of cracked windows before being swept away by the breeze. Pedestrians walked a little faster as they neared him, just slightly, but enough to notice. A soft rustling sounded behind him. A white boy around 10 years old was riding his bike along the sidewalk, wearing a crumpled sports shirt, dusty shoes, and platinum blonde hair tousled by the wind. He slowed down when he saw Martin, standing alone, his eyes curious and wary. The bicycle rolled slowly past the bookstore, and the boy hesitated, then spoke. Not loudly, but enough to cut through the silence that hung over the neighborhood. "Mister, are you lost?" Martin looked up. His eyes were calm and clear, yet not easy to read. Nothing was frightening in them, but they weren't entirely inviting either. He didn't answer right away. He simply gave a small nod, acknowledging that the boy had asked a question worth considering. Then he replied, his voice deep and composed, "No, I know exactly where I am." The boy blinked. It wasn't the kind of answer he expected. It wasn't funny, nor was it firm. He stared at Martin a moment longer, now more genuinely curious than afraid. But then a woman's voice called out from a distance, probably his mother's, and he quickly turned his head. He pedaled away without another word, leaving Martin alone amid the long stretch of leaf-slick pavement. The wind shifted. The smell of hot asphalt rose into the air, mingling with fading traces of grass and wilted leaves. Martin watched the little bicycle grow smaller, then turned back to the glass door of the bookstore. The reflection told him no one was standing behind him, yet it no longer looked like the same reflection he had seen at first. Something in the boy's gaze had made him reevaluate himself, as if he had indeed gotten lost, but not on the streets, rather in the eyes of a child, where no prejudice existed. Yet questions always did. He exhaled. Not long, not heavy. Stepping back from the glass, he tucked the book into the inner pocket of his coat. It wasn't a book to read, it was something to keep his hand from clenching when disrespected. A man like him, standing in a neighborhood like this, was still easily misplaced, simply by being where he belonged. But today, he didn't need to speak first. He had learned that sometimes the right thing begins only after the simplest question, "Are you lost?" And from there, everything begins to shift. Martin did not answer the boy. He smiled, just faintly, as if the question were a dry leaf falling onto his shoulder, enough to feel but not worth brushing off. That smile did not erase the strangeness of the scene in which he stood, nor did it carry any intention to explain. It was simply a calm face and a presence that made the space around him slow down by a beat. The boy had ridden off, the squeaky spin of his wheels merging with the sounds of a late afternoon street. Martin remained still, eyes fixed on the old bookstore, but that gaze was not of someone reminiscing. It was not the look of nostalgia, but more like someone inspecting a faint crack on the glass, something unnoticed by others, but long existing. Perhaps this place had once been the beginning of something, or perhaps it had witnessed things never spoken of again. Across the street, a police car turned in. Inside, a young officer furrowed his brow upon seeing Martin. He saw no strange movement, yet he slowed down. His eyes swept over the simple clothes, the worn shoes, then paused on a posture too upright for a neighborhood used to leisurely walks. No shopping bags, no children, no signs of someone who lived here. Just a black man standing straight in front of a closed bookstore, and to him, that alone was reason for suspicion. The car stopped across the street. The officer did not turn on the lights, nor did he use the loudspeaker. He simply sat behind the glass, hand resting on the wheel, eyes fixed on the man opposite. Martin did not turn his head. Maybe he knew he was being watched. Maybe not, but his stance did not change, as if the space between him and the bookstore was still the only thing worth paying attention to. A woman stepped out from a nearby house, carrying a trash bag. Her steps hesitated at the sight before her. She glanced at the officer, then at Martin. She said nothing, but her face flickered with unease. She turned back inside, closing the door quicker than usual. Martin tilted his head slightly, as if to hear something better. But what he heard was not sound. It was a shift in the air, the kind familiar to someone used to being watched. A stare held too long, a footstep that wavered, a silence shaped by suspicion. All of it was happening at once. He drew a deep breath, not to restrain himself, but to remind his body how it felt to be in a space that could turn on him at any moment. On the pavement, his shadow stretched long, cutting across the sidewalk like an invisible line between two worlds. One, his personal history; the other, the perception of the man watching from behind the wheel. The officer opened the car door, slowly, just enough to signal that something was about to be confirmed. He pressed his radio, speaking no words. A protocol had begun without announcement, started by nothing more than a look. Martin remained in the same place, his hands by his sides, palms inward. Every movement was within view, not attention-grabbing, but impossible to dismiss. No one held a camera, no one spoke, but something small was beginning to shift in the long, maintained order of this neighborhood, and the man standing there was not lost. He was waiting for the moment when others would have to ask themselves, who truly does not belong here? The police car remained parked at the corner like a patient animal waiting for a signal, but not long after, the passenger door opened. Another officer stepped out, taller than his partner and seemingly older by a few years in the force. He didn't approach Martin right away, but folded his arms across his chest and leaned against the car, his eyes squinting in the sunlight while also sizing up the man across the street. Perhaps in this neighborhood of white-painted houses and expensive cars, Martin Hayes's motionless stance had unsettled the familiar sense of control they were used to having. The younger officer was the first to speak. He walked over, adjusting his jacket button, an unnecessary gesture with deliberate intent. As he neared Martin, he stopped at just the right distance to remain within tactical safety, but close enough to make his words feel personal. "Excuse me," he said, not with politeness, but with the tone of a routine check. "What are you doing here?" Martin turned his face toward him, his gaze still calm, but now with a slight lift of the brow. "I'm standing," he replied, voice low and clear, offering neither excuse nor anger. "Standing?" the officer repeated, as if it were an invalid response. He looked Martin over again, then asked, more sharply this time, "Do you have any identification? You don't seem like someone who lives around here." Martin slowly pulled one hand from his coat pocket. "I am not obligated to present ID unless you have a legal reason to request it." The older officer had stepped closer by now. He nodded at his younger partner, then took a step forward himself. "Careful now," he said, half joking, half serious. "Wearing a suit without going to work, standing in front of a closed bookstore. Looks like you enjoy hiding something in that briefcase?" Martin turned to face the man who had spoken. His expression didn't change, but his gaze sharpened, not from offense, but as if deciding whether the exchange was worth continuing. "Are you trying to initiate a situation, or just making conversation?" he asked, his voice still gentle, but now deliberately measured. "If it's the first, I'm ready to cooperate by the book. If it's the second, I don't think this conversation needs to go on." The younger officer hesitated slightly, perhaps unaccustomed to being met with a tone that was neither defensive nor submissive. The older officer gave a mocking smile and shook his head. "Relax, friend. We're just checking. No one's trying to make trouble, but you have to understand, standing alone like this, around here, it raises questions." "What exactly raises your suspicion?" Martin asked, this time without the courtesy in his eyes. "The suit I'm wearing, the color of my skin, or the fact that I don't lower my head when approached?" That question flipped the roles of who was questioning whom. The older officer let out a strained laugh, clearly less comfortable now. The younger one glanced over his shoulder and noticed a few eyes beginning to watch them from behind windows. "We're conducting area security," he said stiffly, as if reciting a regulation, "and you're drawing unnecessary attention." Martin didn't respond immediately. He simply stepped back half a pace, his hands still visible, then spoke in a slower tone. "Perhaps what draws attention isn't that I'm standing here, but that two armed officers are questioning a citizen for a reason they can't even name." A brief silence passed. Not long enough to call it tense, but enough for anyone watching from a distance to understand that this was no longer a casual exchange. And the officers, though they hadn't realized it yet, had already begun to lose control of the moment. The younger one stood across from Martin, his eyes scanning past his shoulder as if searching for something out of sight. He stepped forward half a pace, his movement deliberately wider than needed, and suddenly reached toward the leather briefcase Martin held loosely under his left arm. No warning, no proper request, just the reflex of someone in uniform who believed surprise could substitute for authority. The briefcase hit the pavement, its leather scraping the rough concrete with a dry, fractured sound. The flap sprang open from the impact, and a book slid out, cover facing up, landing right beside Martin's shoe. It was not political material, nor personal records. It was a thick, hardcover book with the author's name printed in small silver letters. Martin D. Hayes, Between Silence and Power. The older officer glanced down, saw the cover, and ignored it. The younger one gave a dry, smug laugh, the kind of laugh that confirmed a prejudice. He nudged his partner and said loud enough for the whole street to hear, "See that? Fake intellectual. Carries a book about himself so people think he's somebody." Martin didn't pick up the book right away. He looked at it, as if watching a part of himself exposed in public without anyone caring to look closer. It was a biography, written by a journalist who had followed his public service career for over 10 years. The book had once been displayed prominently at the state library the year he was re-elected, and later pushed to the bottom shelf in districts that rejected reform. Now it lay quietly on the ground, unrecognized, untouched. A middle-aged woman stepped out from a nearby cafe, her eyes catching the scene on the sidewalk. She looked at the book, then at Martin, then at the two officers standing with judgment in their posture, but she said nothing. She turned away after meeting the younger officer's stare, a look strong enough to make anyone avoid getting involved. Martin bent down, picked up the book with both hands, and slowly, he brushed a bit of dust from the edge of the cover, then closed the briefcase without a word. That silence was not retreat. It was a space he left on purpose, like a frame without a painting, inviting others to see where they stood in that picture. "You carry a book written about yourself?" the older officer chuckled, as if telling a clumsy joke. "Seems like you invest in your image." Martin looked up. For the first time in this encounter, he met the officer's eyes directly, not glancing away, not avoiding. His voice was deep but firm, ringing out like a knock delivered at the exact right moment. "I don't care it to be recognized. I keep it to remind myself that identity is not something I need permission to exist." The wind shifted, lifting the edge of Martin's coat. The bookstore door behind him creaked slightly, metal brushing metal, then fell silent. Passers-by kept walking, but slower now. No one stopped, yet glances began to shift. A look, not quite a reaction, but already the start of a change, from indifference to doubt, from doubt to witness. As for the younger officer, he showed a hint of unease for the first time. What Martin had just said didn't match anything they had been trained to counter. It carried no anger, no plea. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly who he was, even when others tried to sweep that truth off the ground. And that alone was enough to crack the balance of power, not through action, but through the way a seemingly useless book had just become something that made a forgotten truth impossible to ignore again. The older officer stepped to the left, blocking the walkway in front of Martin as if creating a controlled perimeter while silently signaling the growing number of onlookers. There was no formal warning, no calm-voiced request like those in procedural training videos. Just a cold, flat command, sit down. Now. Martin didn't ask why. He looked around, gauging the distance between cooperation and insult, then slowly lowered himself, sitting on the edge of the sidewalk. The dry, cool gravel pressed against the back of his trousers, his spine straight, both hands resting on his knees. The leather briefcase was now tightly closed, placed beside his left foot. His posture no longer conveyed equality, but it did not imply submission either. Across the street, a resident pulled out her phone. Standing partly hidden behind a lamppost, she raised the device just high enough to capture the full scene without drawing immediate attention. In her lens, Martin appeared as an unfamiliar figure in a neighborhood designed to eliminate surprises. A black man sitting still beneath the slanting afternoon sun, surrounded by two white officers, gradually tightening the language of their body. The younger officer shifted slightly, placing one hand on the baton at his waist and the other pointed toward Martin. "You know why I stopped you?" he asked, his voice low but thick with authority. "Because you don't fit." Martin tilted his head. He heard every word clearly but didn't respond right away. Instead, his eyes found the phone across the street. His face appeared on the live stream screen. The angle was too far for audio, but close enough to catch each expression. Then he turned back, looked directly at the younger officer, and asked a simple question. "What are you doing, knowing the person in front of you has committed no crime?" It wasn't a challenge nor a plea. The question landed like a flat mirror, emotionless, reflecting only truth. The officer froze for a second. His partner cleared his throat and stepped forward. "Stand up. Turn around. We need to search for you." The command was delivered without hesitation. They were used to this approach. It was part of their toolkit for managing encounters. Martin rose, his movements clear and steady. He raised both hands to shoulder level, not hurried, not hostile. As the younger officer began moving his hands down both sides of Martin's body, from shoulders to waist, Martin spoke again, this time facing the phone camera. "I am being searched without clear cause, but I will not resist, because I want each of you and everyone watching through that screen to understand that the wrong is not in the reaction. It lies in how this has been allowed to become normal." The phone trembled slightly in the young woman's hand. She held her breath. An older man nearby, still holding an untouched cup of coffee, also paused. What had started as a small crack in the neighborhood's image of safety was now spreading like a fracture that could no longer be sealed. The officer said nothing. His hands touched Martin's belt, checked the back of his jacket, then lowered. He found nothing, and he didn't find the usual sense of control either, perhaps because Martin's silence carried no fear, only a kind of balance that made people hesitate to touch it. A car slowly turned onto the street and stopped. No siren, no flashing lights, but inside, a pair of eyes watched while fingers tapped a phone. And somewhere among the hundreds watching the live broadcast, a new question was beginning to form. Who is truly making this neighborhood no longer match the values it prides itself on? At the far end of the sidewalk, near a small flower shop closing its stall, a little boy in a dark knit cap held onto his mother's hand. The two of them stood at the edge of the street, just ordinary passers-by who had unintentionally stepped into a scene they never meant to stop for. The mother, a woman in her early 30s, held a cloth shopping bag and a phone with a map app open, searching for the nearest pharmacy. The boy looked up toward the group in front of the bookstore, where a black man had just been ordered to stand, and the officers were close enough to hear his breathing. The boy squinted, then gently tugged his mother's sleeve. His voice was a whisper, soft enough that no one else could hear it. "Mom, he looks like the man from that speech on TV the other day." The mother paused for a moment. In that brief instant, the phone in her hand remained lit, but her gaze drifted from the map. She looked toward Martin. His face was turned slightly as he spoke with one of the two officers, and his upright posture made her thoughts begin to slow. Those eyes, not familiar, yet not certain enough to be sure, stirred something in her memory. The speech had aired on multiple channels last month about justice reform and the right to live without being guided by prejudice. The man on the screen back then had stood the same way. He hadn't needed to raise his voice to make people stop. He hadn't needed a title for his words to be heard. The mother glanced at her son. He was still staring at the scene ahead, his innocent eyes unable to fully understand but already sensing something was wrong. She turned to him, meaning to say, "That's not him," a way to brush off what she couldn't yet confirm. But the words didn't come. The longer she looked, the more she felt the child might not be wrong. She shifted the phone to her other hand, slowly turning her wrist so the lens pointed toward Martin. Her hand didn't tremble, but her motion slowed, as if weighing whether she was capturing an inconvenient moment or a piece of truth long overlooked by everyone else. The younger officer continued, repeating the procedure, but his gaze now slightly wavered. He noticed more people watching, and the phones were no longer hidden like before. A child's eyes followed from the corner of the flower shop. A woman in a store uniform quietly stepped out of the nearby grocery, her rubber gloves still on. An old man leaned against his bicycle, unsure of what was happening, but with a face heavy with something, the kind of expression old people carry when they see something return that they have witnessed in their own time. Martin seemed to sense the shift. He did not turn his head, but his voice rose again, this time softer, as if intended for a space farther than those standing close by. When children begin to recognize faces from stories of justice, maybe we should ask ourselves what adults are teaching by staying silent. The officer didn't respond. The air tightened, not because of the volume of his voice, but from the weight of each word spoken. The child looked up at his mother, then gripped her hand more tightly. The woman didn't look away from her phone. It was no longer just a device to record. It had become her way of saying she did not turn aside, her way to ensure that one day her child would know his mother had stood there on what had seemed like an ordinary afternoon and chose to look until the truth could no longer be dismissed as someone else's burden. Martin kept his gaze fixed in the space between the two officers before him, neither stepping back nor showing defiance. As the older officer leaned in to scan around his waist once more, Martin's hand slowly moved toward the inner pocket of his coat. No sudden motion, no alarm triggered. Everything unfolded with the controlled ease of someone far too familiar with being watched through a lens of suspicion. He pulled out his wallet, a movement so ordinary that neither officer reached for their weapons. They remained still, as if waiting to see what kind of performance the man before them might attempt next. Martin opened the wallet, not handing it over, not thrusting it forward with attitude. He held the card between two fingers, revealing the embossed lettering, faintly glowing under the late afternoon sun. Both officers leaned down slightly to glance at it. A silver hard card with white trim, displaying the words Governor's Executive Identification across the center, along with a photo ID. Below was a signature and state-issued number. It was not a common credential, rarely seen outside official circles, not something the average citizen would recognize at a glance. The kind of document is just official enough to resist forgery and just unfamiliar enough to be dismissed by those who don't follow politics. The younger officer let out a laugh, a sound meant to shatter a moment of tension. He looked at his partner, shrugged, and said, "People can print anything online these days. A card doesn't prove anything." Martin didn't respond. He didn't need to defend the card because he understood they weren't rejecting the object itself, but the truth they didn't want to accept. The fact that they had seen the title, read the name, and still chose to believe it was fake said more about them than about him. The older officer tilted his head, reading more carefully. A flicker of hesitation crossed his forehead, but it vanished quickly, replaced by a cold, neutral tone. "If you were the governor, you wouldn't be standing here silently in the middle of a street." Martin folded the wallet and slipped it back into his coat, the motion firm, like returning something misused. He was about to step aside when a silver delivery van turned onto the street. The driver, a young white man in a courier uniform, started to turn down the side alley but slowed at the sight on the curb. The tires squealed slightly as the van braked. He rolled down the window, squinting at Martin, and suddenly blurted, "Wait, isn't that—" The final word dropped off as if even he couldn't trust what he was seeing. Martin glanced over and gave a faint nod. Their eyes met, just for a beat. The younger officer snapped his head around. "What did you say?" The delivery driver said nothing. He swallowed, pulled back inside the van, then turned the vehicle and left the street faster than he'd arrived. He didn't speak again, but that brief encounter left behind a ripple of doubt that none of the three men left standing could dismiss. The older officer glanced at his partner, his expression no longer certain. Martin's silence, the legitimate ID, the courier's glance, and the rising number of phones being raised at street corners, all of it formed a pressure that had no shape, but was beginning to shift the balance of authority in the moment. Martin didn't need to add a word. He stood still, eyes turned toward the fading sunlight across the bookstore's front window, as if time itself had paused just enough to let those present grasp that something had shifted, and that not recognizing him was no longer an excuse anyone could lean on. The delivery van cleared the corner, and the silence among the three men on the sidewalk deepened. The younger officer stared after the van for a moment, his jaw tensing as if swallowing something hard to name. He turned back toward Martin with a visible discomfort, as though Martin's silence, not the situation, was what had made things awkward. His older colleague stood with arms still folded, but his gaze had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something out of rhythm, half doubtful, half guarded, as if waiting for a command from someone no longer inside their chain of control. Martin said nothing. He brushed the dust from the side of his coat where it had picked up grime earlier, then straightened his posture once again. That stance carried no defiance. It was the bearing of someone who did not need to prove his right to stand in the middle of a city. And yet, for some, that alone was easy to mistake for attitude. The younger officer stepped forward, quicker than at any point before. He offered no warning, no justification. His hand landed on Martin's shoulder and pressed down firmly. "I told you to sit down, didn't I?" His voice snapped, blending command with unease. Martin staggered half a step as the sudden pressure pushed his shoulder downward, his elbow hitting the edge of the curb's step. The impact was not loud, but sharp, leaving a dark red scrape that ran from his wrist to the cuff of his shirt. His briefcase tumbled to one side, landing with a dull, heavy thud. Someone in the crowd called out, "Hey, take it easy!" But the voice was quickly lost in the shuffle of hesitant footsteps and stifled sighs. Martin sat back down on the sidewalk. He didn't shove the officer's hand away. He didn't wipe the blood. He left it there, a bright red line on his skin, jarring like a mark across a blank page. The officer stood above him, hand hovering near his belt, not quite threatening, but pressing enough to control. Across the street, more people raised their phones higher. There were cameras. Voices were being recorded. No one intervened, but everyone was capturing it, and in their eyes, the moment was unmistakably a line, a point where dignity and authority met without violence, yet left behind the sting of injury. Martin lifted his head. His eyes were still, like water without wind, yet not empty. Looking straight at the younger officer, he spoke, his voice low, but each word fell clear as nails, driven into a wall already cracked. "It's not that card. What you're disrespecting is this entire state." No one replied. That sentence hung in the air like a court summons just delivered, not to persuade, but to remind. For a second, the older officer behind him shifted half a step back. The younger one remained still, but his gaze wavered, moving from Martin to the phones now aimed in their direction, then back to the bleeding face before him, unsure whether to respond with authority or regret. A light breeze passed through, carrying the scent of earth and the sweat now clinging to their uniform collars. Behind them, sunlight slanted across the row of buildings and struck the faded sign above the bookstore. There, faint letters still lingered on the glass. "Independent thought begins with the first question," and maybe, just now, that question had been asked, not by Martin, but by those watching, and by something neither officer yet realized, that what they were trying to resist was not a man, but the truth, moving closer by the minute. Martin sat still, blood from his wrist slowly seeping through the fabric. He didn't raise his phone immediately, but calmly pulled it from the inside pocket of his coat, a gesture so composed it seemed intentionally non-alarming. His thumb slid across the screen and tapped a single prioritized number. No name, no icon, just a string of special characters that could not be confused with any regular contact. He brought the phone to his ear. Without waiting for the person on the other end to speak, he said in a firm, clipped tone, "It has reached the point for intervention." Then he hung up. No explanation, no discussion, and he didn't look at the two officers now frozen in place. That sentence hadn't been aimed at anyone directly, but it hit the air like a command issued from a place no one expected. The younger officer furrowed his brow, suspicion giving way to alertness. But before he could ask a thing, a sound rolled in from the head of the street. The low, synchronized hum of engines. Deep, powerful. Not the sound of local patrol cars. Not civilian enforcement. It was the heavy, unified noise of vehicles that only appeared under exceptional circumstances. A fleet of black SUVs with raised chassis and specialized license plates, the state flag fluttering on short antennas, entered the street like a controlled tide. 3 vehicles stopped in a V formation in front of the corner bakery. The rear door of the center SUV opened first. A white man in a dark blue suit, silver sunglasses, stepped out, carrying no badge, no weapon, but the moment people filming saw him, some instinctively stepped back, their hands still holding phones, but their eyes now wholly changed. It was Richard Langston, Director of State Security, a figure never seen in public except during top-level meetings. Langston needed no questions. He had received the full report just minutes earlier, from a phone call he'd never imagined getting on a quiet afternoon like this. He walked toward Martin, his eyes passing over the blood on the wrist, then settling on the 2 officers standing rigidly, as if awaiting judgment. No introductions were made. No title needed to be repeated. Langston stopped a few steps short of them, pulled a slim tablet from his coat pocket, tapped the screen a few times, then read out 2 names in a voice that was both clear and cold. Bryce Weller, Thomas Reed. There were no follow-up questions. No, "Who are you?" because he already knew. Their names had appeared in the system the moment Martin pressed that call. A series of alerts, internal reports, and behavioral reviews, all of which surfaced the instant the retrieval order was issued. Langston's reading of the names wasn't to verify them, it was to confirm that everything had already been logged. Officer Bryce flinched half a step. Hearing his name called out in the middle of the street made him shudder, like realizing for the first time that he no longer had control over the situation. Thomas Reed, the older of the 2, remained still, but the fingers at his side clenched slightly, trembling. Langston watched them for another beat, then turned to the aide behind him. A folder, already prepared, was handed over, not because this situation had been anticipated, but because any call from Martin Hayes automatically triggered an emergency protocol. Temporarily suspend both officers from duty. An independent investigation will begin today, he said, his voice not loud but sharp enough to cut through any defense about to form. The crowd began to shift. Phones moved slower now, but never dropped from the scene. Langston's presence, the armored convoy, and the sound of the officers' names spoken aloud formed a chilling message the system had just sent back to itself. No one is beyond scrutiny, not even those in uniform. Martin remained silent. He still sat there, wrist bloodied, spine upright, eyes resting on the leather briefcase still tilted at the edge of the step. In less than 5 minutes, the power dynamic had shifted. Not through resistance, but through a timely signal from the one person on this street who never had to raise his voice to be heard. The engines of the black SUVs had barely gone quiet when the first footsteps began to appear along the sidewalks. People came from every direction, not in a rush, but no longer with the casual gait of passers-by. They gathered in small clusters, first nearby shopkeepers, then drivers pulling over mid-route. A couple walking their dog stopped abruptly, and a young woman on her phone paused mid-conversation. All bore the same expression: confusion, suspicion, and anticipation. Each phone lifted became an unblinking eye. Each angle recorded was a choice to witness, and in that moment, The distance between those filming and the man being filmed disappeared. From the corner, the signal tower began to lag, as if hundreds of streams were now fighting to send out the same image. A few live streams switched to public view, tagged with the address 307 Charlesworth Street, and a flurry of hastily typed hashtags. Governor Hayes, police accountability, live from. In under 5 minutes, the street once known for quiet foot traffic had become the center of a live broadcast no one had scripted. View counts ticked up by the thousands on the screen of the first live stream, followed by waves of comments and shares. Viewers from other states, even distant cities, had already recognized Martin Hayes in the blurry, angled footage from the beginning, and that alone made it impossible to reverse what had happened with any simple explanation. Across the city, on the 6th floor of Central Police Headquarters, a meeting was cut short. Chief Donald McCrae, in office for nearly 10 years, had just taken a call from his staff. He opened the internal surveillance feed and saw multiple live streams. Without audio, he knew things had slipped beyond his administrative reach. He called the emergency line for District 13, where his 2 officers were facing a man he should have called governor from the start. After 3 rings, the call connected. His voice was steady and firm. "Stop, right now. No further action. I repeat, stop immediately." But no reply came. The person on the line was no longer on site. Any command or damage control had arrived too late. McCrae slumped into his chair, staring at comments flashing by. "Is that the governor? What are they doing? This can't be real." Outside the bookstore, Martin stayed where he was, wrist now wrapped in clean gauze. He hadn't said a word since Langston named the officers, but silence no longer meant absence. It made everything else more visible, harder to ignore. Officer Bryce kept glancing between the crowd and the cameras. His face twitched as if scrambling for a way out, but no words could soften the heat now rising behind him. Langston gave a quiet signal to his driver to shut the SUV door. He hadn't planned to come here, but nothing followed the plan anymore. A clip from various live streams was spreading fast. Martin Hayes, bloodied hand, ID on his knee, 2 named officers beside. No one controlled the story now. The crowd did, and they had already spoken for him. Martin slowly rose. The gauze on his wrist had not absorbed all the blood. A blurred red stain marked the white cloth, but he paid it no mind. His left hand moved, not hurried, not showy, just brushing a line of dust off his sleeve. His eyes stayed fixed on the tiled sidewalk, the spot where he had been forced to sit, and where the truth had just stepped out from silence. He did not shout, accuse, or demand an apology, but with each step forward, the crowd behind him drew back slightly, not in fear, but out of respect for something becoming too clear to name. He stopped in the center of the space the crowd had formed, facing the 2 officers whose names had just been read. A light wind blew from the east, shifting the hem of his coat, carrying the damp scent of the market street. The state flag on the car antenna still fluttered, a stiff detail in a scene now fragile. Martin didn't look at them as men facing justice. He looked at them as men who had lost something they never fully understood. The privilege of a system once accepted as normal. His voice rose, needing no mic, no repetition, just one question, clear and direct. "If I didn't have power, would I have a broken arm by now?" No one answered. Officer Bryce looked down, his thumb caught between 2 belt loops. His face flushed, not with shame, but from having no answer to a question he couldn't deny. Thomas Reed sighed softly, eyes no longer scanning the crowd, but fixed on a brick beneath his feet. Someone in the crowd stepped closer, holding a phone at chest level. Live stream still on. Comments scrolled fast. "This is the question the whole country needs to hear. It's obvious now. No power means you're the next headline." Martin said nothing more. He let the question hang, like a long shadow cast across a wall built from habit, not reason. And it was that silence, not sirens, not anger, that made people hold their breath, because it forced them to imagine the version they'd ignored. If it hadn't been him, if it were a boy, a mother, a worker, what would have happened? Someone lowered their phone to truly see. A student pulled down his mask, eyes wide, not from fear but realization. An old man nodded slowly, as if hearing something long lost in the halls of power. Bryce stepped back, heel catching the curb. He nearly stumbled, then looked to his partner. But Reed wasn't looking at him anymore. For a moment, they both seemed small, not for their ranks or their failure, but because the truth no longer stood with them. Langston stood still by the car, hands folded. He didn't interrupt. He didn't try to control the moment. He knew real authority isn't in giving orders, but in knowing when to stay silent so the right thing can speak for itself. And Martin, still watching the faces before him, understood that a single question, asked by the right person, at the right time, in the right place, could force an entire system to look inward, not through verdicts, but through what could no longer be denied. The video was uploaded less than an hour after Martin left the scene. 2 minutes and 28 seconds long, it began with him standing, wrist bandaged, blood seeping through the scene, and ended with the question that silenced the entire street. If I didn't have power, would I have a broken arm by now? The image of a black man in a plain coat standing before 2 police officers surrounded by a crowd, relearning how to see the truth. And by nightfall, that video had become something no system could take down fast enough. Its spread moved faster than any platform could anticipate. Social media is filled with clips, subtitled versions, and screenshots of that single sentence, bolded, "If I weren't the governor." Not because it was a political statement, not because it came from a crafted media campaign, but because it was a truth exposed most simply. Without a title, without power, what would have happened to a person in the middle of the street? Countless users began sharing the question alongside their own stories. A man stopped for parking in a white neighborhood without a sign. A college student searched for carrying a black hoodie. A mother was afraid to let her child walk to school because kids get mistaken too easily. They didn't claim victimhood. They just needed a reason to speak what they had silently endured. Major news outlets couldn't ignore it. The story made front pages, not for shock value, but like a wound demanding to be looked at. The next morning's print headline read, "Can Identity Save a Life?" Meanwhile, digital editions chose something simpler. He was the governor, but what if he wasn't? TV shows brought in experts, lawyers, and psychologists, but audiences didn't wait for analysis. They already understood. The system they trusted to ensure fairness might not see them as citizens, unless they carried a title to shield them. On college campuses, "If I weren't the governor" appeared on bulletin boards, printed by students and taped outside classrooms. A political science class held an open forum without a professor. Students rewrote the sentence through their own stories, of their families, their neighborhoods, and their memories, once dismissed as isolated incidents. At the police station where the 2 officers had been named, a group of residents left flowers at the door without a word. Not to mourn Martin. He was not dead, not hospitalized, and not in need of sympathy. The flowers marked a new boundary, a place where past silence was no longer seen as neutral. Martin Hayes made no further statements. He declined interviews, posted nothing, and released no commentary. When a reporter called the governor's office, the secretary simply replied, "He's already said what needed to be said." And so, a single sentence, without shouting, without anger, became a symbol of resistance. Not because it was loud, but because it forced people to ask what happens to the rest of society, those without enough power to ask that question and remain whole afterward. "If I weren't the governor," that sentence was no longer hypothetical. It became a test, and not everyone passed. The next morning, newspapers across the country, from New York to Chicago, carried the same image. Martin Hayes, standing tall, wrist wrapped in white gauze, his face showing neither anger nor avoidance. Beside him were the 2 suspended officers, and behind him a crowd that needed no slogans to make every frame feel heavy. Most headlines shared a single tone: "Governor treated like a suspect in broad daylight." What began as a single confrontation spread across media channels with the force of an undeniable event. On national television, the footage aired with nonstop commentary from analysts, lawyers, and scholars, but the moment that stopped the country didn't come from experts. It came from a short op-ed in a local paper. The writer, a white journalist who had covered racial protests for decades, opened simply, "I've seen this before, but it was civilians. Now it's the governor." The next line was slower, almost a confession, and what chilled me wasn't that it happened, but that I wasn't surprised. I've grown used to it. And that's the problem. The piece offered no legal analysis. It didn't excuse the officers, nor elevate Hayes as a martyr. It just recorded the feeling of someone who had lived long enough in this society to know that skin color can eclipse title, and authority can't always shield someone from a biased stare behind a badge. After that, people began speaking up. They didn't wait to be asked. They wrote, posted, and connected their stories. Stories once dismissed with, "It was probably a misunderstanding." A woman recalled being told to open her trunk for looking tense after grocery shopping. A student wrote about being stopped for wearing headphones in a wealthy suburb. A father shared how he was pulled from his car while driving his kid to school just so police could check if he was the real parent. These stories didn't surface to exploit Hayes's case. They appeared because someone had finally broken the long silence people used to excuse with, "I didn't hit record." Martin didn't ask anyone to speak, but his act of standing in the street, his eyes steady in front of the lens, the question he posed like a test of conscience, all of it made thousands wonder, what if I were the one in that video? Within law enforcement, discomfort began to spread. Officials could no longer calm the public with phrases like, "under internal review," or "procedures were followed," because the issue was no longer about one incident. It was about a crumbling faith. If even a governor had to flash ID to prove he didn't deserve to be treated like a criminal, then what hope was there for those without such cards? In neighborhoods where similar events had happened with no cameras to capture them, people began gathering to share. Not to protest, but to affirm that what happened to them was real. They wrote down times, places, and descriptions. Volunteers started mapping past reports of misconduct. The red dots grew by the day, sketching out something all too familiar. An America still tethered to the habit of using skin color as a shortcut for threat. From the scene, Martin had left quietly, holding no press conference. But what he left behind, through action and composure, kept spreading without any official statement. And as people shared stories of being pulled over, questioned, and treated like anomalies in the towns they were raised in, they weren't attacking the police. They were reclaiming the right to be seen as citizens, something that should have been obvious, but for too long had never been guaranteed. Amid the flood of news reports, analyses, and political commentary, a short blog post on a student platform unexpectedly captured national attention. Its author was a 13-year-old seventh grader at a public school in North Carolina. No profile picture, no real name, just under 10 lines, written in simple words with a few spelling errors, but enough to make tens of thousands of adults stop and read every word. He wrote, "Yesterday I saw a video of a man standing in the street being pushed down by 2 police officers, even though he's the governor. My mom said he's a good man, really smart and strong, but if they still treated him like that, then what does that make me?" No exclamation points, no outrage, yet the final question struck like a slap against denial. It didn't need context. It didn't need defending. Its simplicity was its sharpest edge. A child, too young to fully grasp the meaning of citizenship, already understood the fragility of presence and how easily that presence could be erased by skin color. The post was quickly shared across major platforms. Journalists quoted it without edits. Public figures read it on live streams. A black congresswoman read the words aloud on the State House floor and admitted she wouldn't know how to answer if her son asked the same thing. From there, the phrase, "could be me," began circulating as a label for an unnamed fear. At first, it was shared quietly. A black and white photo of Martin's biography resting on a desk, captioned, "He had a title, I don't. Could be me." A college student posted a photo of their college acceptance letter with the note, "First day of school, Mom said no hoodies, not for the weather. Could be me." No movement was launched, no leaders, no organizers, but within 48 hours, Could Be Me had spread across nearly every state, in schools, offices, train stations, and unnoticed street corners. People scribbled it on paper, chalked it on sidewalks, stitched it onto jackets. Some pinned it between job title lines on their name tags, a reminder that identity means little if the person across from you refuses to see it. Teachers began printing excerpts of the blog for classroom reading. Some schools opened the week by reading the boys' question aloud, not for discussion, but to sit with it. In city council meetings, people who once stayed silent now stood up to speak. They didn't debate Martin's case. He needed no defense. They spoke about their neighborhoods, where their children went to school, and how, without clarity, injustice would continue as the norm. In the media, the story was no longer referred to by Martin's title. No one said governor or called it shocking. It became known as the beginning of the question that cracked, when the smallest voice spoke first, and the powerful were finally forced to listen. Martin Hayes still made no statement. When asked about the boy's post, he told reporters, "I read it, and I hope there comes a day when that question no longer needs to be written. But for now, people are still writing, and every word added to this growing story is shaping something the law hasn't yet caught up to, but society has begun to repair, a value system grounded not in title, but in human dignity." And for the first time, instead of asking, "Who has the right to speak?" people are asking, "Why did the silent have to wait for power just to live fully?" Before the media storm had time to settle, a live-streamed internal speech from the Georgia State Security Academy reignited public debate. The room wasn't full, just a routine session among entry-level officers. But the speaker's words didn't stay within the academy walls. She was Lieutenant Nora Ellison, 14 years in the force, formerly in charge of recruitment and training at a major Midwestern police department. Her talk wasn't meant to condemn the system or take a political stance. She began with personal reflections, then paused mid-sentence, looked up, and said plainly, "We weren't trained to discriminate. No manual tells us black skin is dangerous, but if you ask me what a rookie learns first on the street over the past 10 years, I have to say the truth. They learn to suspect black people first." No one interrupted her. A few quietly set their pens down, others exchanged glances, not opposing her but too cautious to nod. In a profession where internal loyalty often ranks above transparency, Nora's words were more than uncomfortable, but her speech was recorded by an intern compiling footage for training. And when the clip was posted with the caption, "When the inside finally says what the public always suspected," it was shared hundreds of thousands of times within 6 hours. The governor's office didn't issue a statement. Instead, Martin Hayes ordered a full audit of all internal enforcement records from the past 3 years with one condition: no department could be excluded, not even those with no public complaints. That order sent a ripple of panic through local departments. Some commanders had long assumed they'd never have to revisit old reports, the kind they once told subordinates to handle internally to avoid escalation. But now, those so-called small cases were at the center of an unprecedented system-wide review. Less than 2 weeks later, a leaked file appeared in a publication known for investigating law enforcement data. It was a nearly 100-page report from 16 county-level police departments, listing every stop, search, bag check, and trunk inspection conducted without a warrant, without video evidence, and a formal report filed to the state system. The alarming part wasn't the number, but the pattern. Over 70% of the violations involved black citizens. 1/3 were minors. Nearly 5% received no official paperwork or explanation at all. News outlets ran headlines. Civil rights groups called emergency sessions. But what silenced many was a question left unspoken. If this is just from 16 departments out of hundreds nationwide, what remains buried in quieter places where complaints are rare? When asked about the leak, Martin Hayes said he wasn't surprised. What worried him wasn't the rate, it was the response. If a system can live with numbers like these without feeling compelled to fix them, then the problem isn't malfunction, it's design, he told a private meeting of agency leaders, and the words he didn't speak that day spread faster than the ones he did. It took data beyond denial for anyone to start listening to voices once dismissed as weak, and once the records are open, they cannot be closed again with a generic apology. What was once called the past is returning, not for revenge, but to reclaim its rightful place as truth. Where it was once pushed out of the report margins for being not serious enough to address, 3 days after the leaked statistics were officially verified as authentic, a handwritten letter arrived at the governor's office. The envelope was plain, with no official seal or return address. The handwriting was neat, each line written in pale blue ink, straight enough to show the writer had taken care with every stroke. It came from Greg Sutherland, a retired police officer who left the force 8 years earlier. He had served as a lieutenant in a county department in the southern part of the state, the same region where many of the overlooked incidents in the report had occurred during his tenure. In the letter, he offered no excuses. He cited no circumstances. His opening line was a rare statement in any internal law enforcement document: "I used to stay silent." Greg wrote that he had witnessed numerous improper traffic stops, groundless searches, and oversteps justified under the phrase field judgment. He admitted he never issued an order to discriminate, but he also never stepped in to stop it. And that, he said, was why he wrote the letter. After years of carrying the weight of knowing that his silence had created a gray zone where even the smallest violations could take root. The letter was not leaked by the press. It was published in full by the governor's office, without edits or commentary. Beneath it was Martin Hayes's response, brief but sharp enough to cut through the layers of justification that often cloud such exchanges. "Silence is not neutral," he wrote. "It is a weapon. And like any weapon, it has a target, a consequence, and people who suffer its impact without ever being armed to defend themselves." He did not single out Greg, nor did he use the letter as a moral campaign. His reply was meant to establish one clear principle. In any system, remaining silent in the face of wrong is not a neutral act. It is complicity, whether intentional or not. That response quickly spread across internal law enforcement forums, where discussions had long been cautious and vague. Younger officers began speaking openly about incidents they once deemed not serious enough, but chose not to intervene in. Conversations that once happened off the clock now entered meeting rooms, with supervisors present, no longer postured in defense. Beyond the profession, many shared Martin's words in other contexts, in schools, workplaces, and family dinners, where prejudiced jokes had once been met with polite laughter. "Silence is not neutral" became a reminder not just for those in uniform, but for anyone who ever thought that staying quiet caused no harm. At a training seminar for educators and mental health professionals, one attendee opened a session on implicit bias in education by quoting that line. Elementary teachers, nurses, mid-level managers, all admitted to moments when they had said nothing as students were nicknamed because of skin color, colleagues were over-scrutinized because of background, or patients were denied tests because they didn't look serious enough. They began writing down those moments not to assign blame, but to confront where indifference had once taken root. Martin issued no call to action. He did not ask the system to implement new policies. He left only one closing sentence in his reply, drawn from a private conversation he once had with his father before entering politics. "Justice does not begin with those in power. It begins with the one who speaks before anything has a name." And from then on, Greg Sutherland was no longer remembered as a former officer who failed, but as proof that real regret, spoken at the right time, can be a beginning to change, not just a late apology. 1 week after the governor's office released its response to Greg Sutherland's letter, an internal seminar took place at the State Police Academy. There was no fanfare, no outside media, just a professional exchange among veteran instructors. But from that small room came a confession that forced law enforcement training to reconsider not only its role within the system, but its influence on the individuals shaped by it. The speaker was Professor Elijah Moore, academic deputy director of the Academy, and a longtime contributor to national-level policy committees. A rare black figure in such a position, Elijah had long been praised as a symbol of internal progress in a command structure that lacked diversity. His talk began with a routine presentation on curriculum reform, but midway through, Elijah paused, removed his glasses, and looked down at the audience. which included many former students. Before I continue, he said, I need to share something personal. It may not fit the theory, but if I don't say it now, I'll regret it. The room went silent. Elijah fixed his gaze on a distant point beyond the front row, then spoke slowly. When I was 15, I was beaten by police, mistaken for a suspect in a robbery. I was walking home from the library when they stopped me. They pushed me to the curb, face to the ground. One officer said I was too calm, which made me suspicious. They found nothing. They didn't apologize. He paused again, then spoke with unflinching clarity. That's why I joined. I didn't want anyone else to feel that. But now, I have to admit something harder. He turned toward the wall where the names of former cadets were displayed on a plaque. 2 of the officers suspended in the Hayes case were once my students. The room froze. No one moved. A few instructors stared at their desks to avoid his eyes. I thought I was teaching them law, teaching them how to know right from wrong, but maybe I was just teaching them how to bend rules without breaking protocol. That sentence landed like a crack in the walls. No shattering sound, but everyone present knew no future class could start with dry definitions without remembering what had just been said. Elijah didn't cry, but his voice trembled. Not from emotion, but from the weight of admitting something that cut to the core of professional honor. He didn't blame the students. He didn't blame the system. He simply said, if I wrote the curriculum, stood at the front, led the room, then I cannot disown the result when it betrays the reason I began. The seminar ended early. No applause, no next speaker, but those who left walked slower than usual, and many began reopening their course materials. The next morning, Elijah found an anonymous letter in his desk drawer. It contained only one sentence, written in pencil. Thank you for not teaching one more lie. He didn't know who wrote it. He didn't ask. But from his confession, a new group quietly formed, gathering instructors and senior officers who had stayed silent, thinking their role ended when the class was over. When asked about that speech during a closed policy meeting, Martin Hayes simply nodded and replied, changing laws is necessary, but changing the minds and hearts of those who write them, that's the root. No transcript was made that day, but everyone remembered it because, for the first time, a man who taught the law admitted he had failed, and that became the reason to hope. The seminar took place in a modest auditorium, ceiling lights dimmed just enough to avoid glare, chairs arranged in a crescent around the podium. The guest list wasn't made public, but those present knew this was no ordinary gathering. The room was quiet from the start, not out of solemnity, but because Elijah Moore's words from the day before were still echoing, vivid and unflinching, giving no one the comfort of distance. Martin Hayes sat in the 3rd row, far left. He arrived without notice, no entourage, no badge or sign of rank, just a familiar figure with a presence impossible to mistake. Those nearby recognized him almost instantly, but no one approached. They simply looked at him, not out of curiosity, but as if witnessing someone who had just stepped out of what the entire field was still trying to face. The program continued with scheduled presentations, but none escaped the weight of the previous day. A young instructor took the stage, gripping a hastily printed draft. He tried to maintain a steady voice, but paused repeatedly, eyes drawn toward Martin's row. Then he folded the paper, looked down at the mic, and said, I was going to present ideas on improving our ethics curriculum, but I think today what I need to do is apologize, not for others' actions, but for my silence. No one responded. A long silence settled over the room. No papers turned, no keys clicked. Everyone seemed to be waiting for something that might finally break the density of the moment. That was when Martin stood up, without signal, without introduction, without cameras turning. He didn't take the stage. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't pick up a microphone. He simply stood, facing forward, and clapped. The first clap landed like a strike in a room gone still. Not rushed, not loud, not dramatic, but steady, firm, and timed just right to let everyone know that what had just been said deserved recognition, not for its bravery, but for the truth no longer deniable. Few people turned to one another. Seconds later, a professor in the middle row stood, then another, then the entire right side. In less than a minute, the whole room rose to join in. No signals needed. No slogans, no smiles, no recordings. Just one simple act repeated, matching applause, even and quiet, as a wordless acknowledgement that something had shifted in that room, something no textbook had ever taught. Elijah Moore, seated at the back near the soundboard, watched through the glass. He didn't step out. He simply placed a hand on the table, nodded slightly, and exhaled. For the first time in hours, what he had believed could never be said aloud. When the applause faded, no one resumed the agenda. The moderator said just one sentence. "We'll stop here. The rest, each of us will write ourselves." Martin didn't linger. He left through the side door without turning back. But the first clap he started had already left something louder than any speech ever recorded. A profession long anchored in authority had, for the first time, bowed its head to a genuine reckoning, and it didn't require rhetoric. It only required someone who knew when to stand. The talk took place in a small auditorium on the campus of a community college in the eastern part of the state, a venue usually reserved for educational seminars or first-year career orientation programs. There was no media coverage, no banners or slogans, just a joint event by the sociology department and a research group focused on systemic equity. Yet when the name Martin Hayes appeared on the flyer posted outside the library gate, the seats were filled early. Martin didn't take the stage. He chose to sit in a circle with the students, at eye level. No microphone, no recording. Beside him was a young woman serving as moderator, and it was her voice that spoke first. "Today, we didn't invite you to talk about titles, but about experience." Martin nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly as if scanning for a memory buried behind a layer of dust. Then he began, not with drama, not trying to move anyone, just a voice recounting what felt like a redacted entry from personal history. "When I was 12, I was held for 3 hours in a convenience store downtown." He paused, then continued, "I wore a red hoodie. It was cold. I had just left school and stopped in to buy a sandwich." The room fell still. Some students folded their arms, sitting a little straighter, not out of fear, but because the way he spoke demanded full attention. "They said I matched the description of a suspect who'd fled a nearby robbery," Martin went on, his hand resting on his thigh as if still remembering the feel of that hard plastic chair. "They made me sit by the entrance, less than 2 meters from the door. For 3 hours, no one hit me, no one raised their voice. They just kept asking the same question over and over." He lifted his head, eyes landing on the second row. "And then a radio crackled in the next room. I heard it. A male voice, steady and cold, said, 'Unknown subject, black male, approaching the door.'" Martin pressed his lips together, his hand unconsciously folding a corner of his sleeve. "That's when I learned that approaching the door didn't mean leaving. It meant being watched, labeled, slotted into a frame of suspicion I never chose to stand in." One student exhaled. Another lowered their head. No one interrupted. What seemed like an ordinary story carried a weight that came not from the details, but from how deeply it still lived inside the lives of millions. Something nameless, scarless, but so persistent it could change how a person walks through glass doors for the rest of their life. Martin sat quietly for a moment, then spoke again, gently clarifying so no one misunderstood why he was sharing it. "I'm not telling this for pity. I don't need tears. I got past it. I'm telling it because I know there are still kids today wearing hoodies, buying sandwiches, and being looked at like shadows no one dares to name." He paused. There was no applause, and he didn't wait for any. This wasn't a speech for motivation. It was a fragment of personal history that no syllabus had ever taught the students in that room to recognize as important. A young brown-skinned student finally asked, her voice low after nearly 2 minutes of silence, "So, what did you do after that?" Martin looked at her, a quiet light in his eyes. "I kept the hoodie," he said, "through college." "Why?" she asked. "Because I wanted to remember," he said, "that I was once seen as suspicious just for existing. And since then, I've chosen to exist without bowing my head ever again." That answer shifted the atmosphere. No analysis was needed, No further questions followed. They simply nodded, and in those nods, it became clear that the lesson on justice had not come from law, but from the moment a man held for 3 hours over a hoodie still sat there, calmly recalling it, like someone keeping fire in his hands to make sure it never goes out. The room stayed quiet after the story of the red hoodie. Martin didn't move, didn't show emotion, but his words seemed to slow time. Some students rested their chins in their hands, others held pens without writing. All eyes stayed on him, not because of fame, but because silence, when carried right, has weight. He lowered his voice, looking out the glass door where late sunlight faded. Then he shifted tone, not to explain, but to ask what others hadn't dared to. "I told that story," he said, "not to guilt anyone, but to ask one thing." He looked toward the students near the aisle. "How many wounds in our society go unseen, just because they don't bleed, don't break bones or make the news?" He waited. "We don't call an action wrong until it happens to someone with a title." Heads turned slightly. Some had likely skimmed past similar stories before. "But that's not one person's fault," he added. "It's a system that taught us to ignore small harms when the harmed don't look important enough." "I don't want pity," Martin said. "Status doesn't cure bias." He sat up straighter. "But it can reveal who holds it, and assumes no one will ever ask." The sentence landed like a quiet verdict. Not angry, but steady. Justice spoken gently so it couldn't be denied. A student near the door looked down. A professor laid a hand on his chest, as if to check he was truly hearing this. Martin stood. He said nothing more. The moderator thanked him, and he nodded slightly. He left through the side aisle, his shadow stretching across the tile in the last light of day. No one spoke, but everyone knew. What mattered most wasn't the story or the role he held. It was the truth he left behind, that bias doesn't need rage to survive, just silence. And sometimes it takes one person who stands without shouting to make everyone else finally look. 4 days after the community college event, the Civic Light Initiative held a small press conference in an old city hall room, now used for public gatherings. With no government funding and no major media presence, the group had gained quiet momentum following the incident involving Governor Hayes. Florence Ng, a former Asian American defense attorney, led the session. She placed a brown box on the table, marked only with a red stamp. Internal use only. Without a speech, she pulled out folders, each packed with records, interviews, and internal reports from police departments across the state. For 30 minutes, Florence explained case after case. Each had been labeled "no prosecution needed" or "resolved administratively," but in nearly all of them the person harmed was black. Some were wrongly detained, others were held without legal counsel. One case made her pause. It involved Darius J. Tompkins, 16, a high school student who died after being stopped by police near the city stadium last November. The report listed respiratory failure from chest compression, no camera footage, no clear witnesses. The officers were quietly reassigned. The file ended with insufficient evidence. Florence looked up. No one spoke. A cameraman froze. An older woman whispered the boy's name. Maybe she knew him. His name, Florence said, was never in any public report. The family didn't sue. No lawyer filed a case. The file closed with no visible resistance. She shut the folder, resting a hand on it as if sealing something long left unspoken. "We're not sharing these to stir outrage," she added. "We're sharing them because these stories were dismissed just because the victims had no voice." The news spread fast. Even without photos or videos, it didn't need shock value. The fact that a 16-year-old died in police hands and no one knew was enough. Online, his name appeared in white letters on black. Who decided he wasn't worth remembering? Governor Hayes' office released no formal statement, but his spokesperson posted one sentence. "Justice does not begin in court. It begins with whether we remember those who no longer can name themselves." From that moment, Darius was no longer just a sealed case. He became proof that a system once built to hide wrongs was now being forced open, name by name. Within days, an interview shook the public again. It featured Helen Marlowe, age 61, a former records clerk in the Kingford district. She admitted, I changed case names, not by mistake but by request. For over 20 years, she had edited codes to quietly downgrade cases, moving them out of legal scrutiny. An illegal detention became a note, an unlawful search a conduct suggestion. Darius's file was one she remembered but wasn't allowed to process. That changed everything. Within 24 hours, Hayes called in legal and historical advisors. He signed an unprecedented 4-page order. Declassify all internal disciplinary files from the past 10 years, including those closed outside court. The last line read, "No file is exempt from public inquiry if it involves how a citizen was treated by those meant to serve them." There was no press, no speech, just quiet action. The order spread beyond the state. Civil groups in nearby states echoed the same question. How many Darius files do we have? Some officials stalled, calling it too complex. But public demand surged. Within 36 hours, a campaign named Unlock the Past had hundreds of thousands of signatures. Even strict law states began reviewing archives. Hayes said little. At one event, he simply stated, "Truth doesn't fix the past, but it's how we stop repeating it." Since then, courthouses became more than places for summons. They became doors to long-denied answers. Justice was no longer only about what had been judged, but about what was finally being revealed, line by line, because of one name, one voice, and one decision to stop hiding. The class took place on a Wednesday morning at the National Institute for Security Behavior and Law Enforcement, a school dedicated to training future officers for the statewide law enforcement system. The course, titled Suspicious Behavior Analysis, was one of the required final-year modules, considered essential for early risk detection and rapid response in real-world scenarios. The class had over 30 students and was taught by veteran instructor Charles Endler, a former Special Operations officer, who had lectured at 7 academies across the South. The lecture began as usual, with slides listing unusual behaviors in public spaces, sudden changes in direction, avoidance of eye contact, wearing heavy coats in inappropriate weather, and standing too long near an emergency exit without entering. But at the 13th point on the slide, a hand went up. The student who stood was Maya Turner, a final-year student with brown skin, a calm face, but eyes that no longer masked discomfort. She didn't speak in a confrontational tone, didn't interrupt, and waited until the instructor asked, "Any questions?" Before calmly stating, "I have an objection." The room went quiet. Maya took a deep breath and looked directly at the podium. Of the 4 examples you just showed, 3 featured images of people of color. I'd like to know if that was by chance or by design. Instructor Endler looked slightly caught off guard. He gave a faint smile, voice steady. "Our teaching model is designed using field data. The images come from verified behavior archives." Myra remained standing. "I'm not objecting to using real data. I'm objecting to how that data is framed as suspicious behavior. When it consistently aligns with a certain appearance." Endler gripped his folder more tightly. His response was slower, voice now edged with caution. "We don't teach students to suspect based on skin color. We teach you to identify risk based on abnormal behavior." "Then please help me define," Maya said, "what counts as abnormal. If a white person standing by an emergency exit for 10 minutes is considered lost, but a person of color doing the same is flagged as suspicious." The room stirred. Some students lowered their heads, others looked toward Maya, then back at the instructor. No one spoke, but the tension was unmistakable. Instructor Endler set his pen on the desk. "Maya, I understand you care about fairness, but here, we're learning to respond quickly. There's not always time for deep consideration. And that's exactly why the model must be fair," Maya replied, her voice still level but more pointed. "If our instincts are trained on the images we saw today, then tomorrow an officer won't respond to behavior. They'll respond to bias." Endler stood silent for a moment. He didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted toward the window, as if weighing something larger than the lesson in front of him. "We teach based on an accepted model," he said, his voice lower. "Accepted by whom?" Maya asked. not with defiance, but with the sincerity of someone about to enter the very system she was questioning, by those who've never been stopped in the street just for not looking safe, or by data sets that have never examined the roots of bias in the data itself. The classroom went quiet again. No one laughed. No one stepped in. The space between the lectern and the student's seat slowly filled with questions no one had asked out loud. Endler didn't respond further. He moved to the next slide and kept lecturing, but no one was paying attention. After class, Maya wasn't reprimanded. Instead, she got a message from a classmate. "Thank you for asking on behalf of everyone who ever felt like a risk indicator just for showing up." The video was taken with a phone left on the desk, unplanned, no angle, no pro audio, but the image was clear, the sound good enough, and most importantly, Maya Turner's question hit just as the country was rethinking its security training definitions. The clip lasted 8 minutes and 20 seconds, starting when she stood in suspicious behavior analysis and asked, "How do you define abnormal? If that abnormal always comes with a certain skin color." A classmate filmed it without comment, only posting, "Today's class, no words needed." Within 12 hours, the clip spread fast, not because it was harsh, but because everyone saw the same thing. For once, bias wasn't called out by accusation, but by a sharp, honest question. Big platforms flagged it as social debate material. Educators, law enforcement trainers, psychologists, and civil rights advocates all shared it. But the strongest response came from people who'd been followed in airports, stopped in stores, or stared at for not looking like they belonged here. State TV asked Maya for an interview. She declined. Reporters called the school. Still, she stayed quiet. Only one request moved her: a handwritten letter from Governor Martin Hayes. It read simply, "I'm not inviting you to honor you. I'm inviting you to help rewrite." On Monday morning, Maya arrived at the state office in an old shirt with 3 notebooks. No press, no cameras. She met with a small team, not to be examined, but to be heard. Hayes sat beside her and said, "We need a new curriculum. A fresh definition of what's suspicious, one that doesn't begin with race, religion, walk, or hair." No one boxed her in, no one cleaned up her words. Maya started with her story and questioned decades of training. Why is walking the wrong way suspect, but standing still in a white neighborhood more so? Why teach how to justify bias instead of how to challenge it? 2 weeks later, the first draft was done. No dangerous behavior chapter, just behavior inconsistent with context. No recycled mugshots, just diverse, real images. No vague terms like looks off, just clear actions tied to time and setting. Hayes read it one rainy night, added one line, "This curriculum isn't to make trainees more suspicious, but to teach them how to trust again without false alarms." On launch day at 5 academies, Maya wasn't there. She sent a voice clip. "If we don't rewrite what was once used to judge us, who will?" The question needed no answer. The curriculum spoke for itself, not to change the past, but to teach those with badges how to truly see what's right before they act. The letter came on a gray afternoon, with no clear postmark and none of the formal touches of political mail, just a folded sheet, slipped under a file sent to the governor's office from a northern farm address. The recipient hadn't expected it, and the sender likely didn't want a reply. It began, "I am the father of the young officer who insulted you." Martin Hayes read it slowly, noting the shaky hand. It wasn't long, but every line held a quiet weight that made him pause to breathe. "My name is Alan Rickman," it read. "I've lived in a small town over 100 miles from the capital. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not defending my son. I'm writing because what he did came from me." He described his son, Officer Bryce Rickman, suspended after the Charlesworth Street incident, as quiet, average in school, but rule-bound. He grew up hearing biased radio, dinner table warnings like, "Don't trust people who aren't like you," and a father who believed caution keeps you alive. "I taught him that people of color often hide something. I had no proof. I believed it because my father did. When he asked why, I said, 'You'll understand one day.' The next sentence, darker in ink, said simply, 'He wasn't wrong. He just did what I passed down.'" Martin set the letter aside and looked out the window. Some apologies seek forgiveness. This one didn't. It only asked not to be ignored. Alan hadn't watched the news at first, but after seeing his son's name under the headline, "2 officers suspended for misconduct toward governor," he watched the clip, read the reports, and finally looked in the mirror. For the first time, he wrote, "I asked if my son did wrong, who taught him what was right?" There were no excuses. Alan didn't blame the job, hard times, or culture. He pointed to fear passed down through silence, not hate, just a failure to teach trust. "I never told my son to hate anyone. I just never showed him how to trust someone different." He didn't ask Martin for anything, only this: if possible, let him learn again. Not in a classroom. From how you stood without bowing your head. Martin never replied, but he kept the letter in a private drawer beside the early draft of the curriculum Maya Turner was helping finalize. He knew that few people face what they've taught their children. Fewer still do it without blame. And that truth, not shouted, not branded on signs, is what made him realize justice isn't about erasing wrongs. It's about whether those who helped cause them have the courage to return and tell the truth, not because they must, but because they can no longer lie to themselves. That day's class wasn't special. 28 students, a plain classroom, wooden desks with chipped paint. The homeroom teacher had invited him after reading an essay a student wrote about the incident on Charlesworth Street. Martin stepped in, didn't go to the lectern, just stood between 2 rows of desks and smiled, saying, "I want to tell you a story. Not to teach a lesson, but to ask a question." He spoke in a calm, steady voice about a father who once wrote him a letter he never published, but had read over and over in his mind. It was from a man who had taught his son to be wary of people of color, not because he hated anyone, but because he believed caution was the best way to protect his child. The class went silent. A few students frowned, some glanced at each other, unsure of what he would say next. Martin didn't pause long. He said the father didn't defend his son, nor deny the facts. He simply admitted he wasn't wrong. He just did what I taught him to do. Martin looked around the room, eyes resting on a boy near the window, then said slowly, "So here's what I want to ask. When we think we're teaching our kids how to stay out of trouble, how to be safer, what exactly are we teaching them?" The teacher stepped back toward the board, not interrupting. A student at the front tilted her head, still holding her pen, but no longer writing. Martin took a step closer to the center. If every piece of advice carries a bit of fear, then when does that fear become a pattern? And that pattern, even if born from love, can still become prejudice. No one spoke, but no one looked away. We grow up in families that tell us to avoid people who dress differently, to steer clear of dark places, to walk faster past loud groups in public. But how many of us were ever taught to tell the difference between risk and bias, he asked, as if he had once been that child too, the one taught to stay quiet, to believe silence was wise, was safe, was proper. There are parents who try to keep their children from trouble by teaching them to avoid people whose skin looks different, and over time, that becomes instinct. Martin lifted his head. His voice didn't rise, but each word landed clearly. "So the question I ask you isn't whether you want to change that. It's, has anyone ever asked where you learned it?" A girl at the back clenched her fists. A boy beside her turned to look. No one laughed. No one looked sad, just a quiet slowing of thought. As if the whole class realized at once, there are things we repeat without ever questioning. Martin stepped toward the door. He left no handouts, no slogans. Only, before leaving, he said one thing. "That father's letter is still in my desk drawer. I keep it not to remember someone else's mistake, but to remind myself that justice doesn't come from grand lessons, but from someone daring to ask the smallest thing. What am I teaching the one who'll come after me?" Then he walked out, leaving behind a question that didn't need an answer right away, but was enough to change how every student in that room would listen the next time someone called something a safety rule. The press briefing was small, held in a ground-floor conference room of the governor's building with fewer than 20 reporters and no nameplates on the table. Martin Hayes sat in the center, no aides behind him, shirt buttoned to the collar, no tie. He came to update the public on the declassification of judicial records across the state, but the questions he faced weren't in the official briefing materials. A young reporter from a local TV station stood and raised her hand just after the presentation ended. Her tone was direct, her question clear. "Mr. Hayes, you were insulted in public. It was caught on camera and went nationwide. Do you intend to sue the police department?" It wasn't the first time the question had been raised. Journalists, commentators, and social media users had debated it repeatedly. Some said that by not taking legal action, he was missing a chance to set a precedent. Others believed he was trying to preserve an image of reconciliation. But this time, Martin was present, and he didn't avoid the question. He looked up, met the young reporter's eyes, and spoke in a steady, low voice. "I don't need a legal verdict." The room fell silent. A few people leaned forward, waiting. "I need the system to see itself in the mirror." He paused, gaze fixed on the one who had asked. "I could sue, and I might win, but it would end with a verdict instead of starting a reckoning. I don't need an apology from one officer. I need the department to reflect on itself, not just through what happened to me, but through all the cases no one filmed." The room grew heavier, not from tension, but from truth. He had named what others avoided. Some wrongs can't be fixed with court fees, and some harms don't need compensation. They need to be placed plainly on the table, in daylight, so no one can pretend they never happened. Days after the briefing, a group of civil rights attorneys sent an open letter to the governor's office. They offered legal representation should Hayes choose to file suit against the police department or any individual involved. "We are prepared to handle the entire legal process without charging any fees," they wrote. "This is not just a personal incident, but a moment that could reshape how the system understands bias in law enforcement." Martin read the letter. He appreciated it, but he declined, not through a formal statement or official call, but with a single line in a short email. "I don't want to shift roles." From the one insulted to the one demanding justice for himself. "Justice isn't something I seek. It's something I want people to see before their identity is taken from them." The reply spread internally before leaking to the public, and it surfaced on a few news sites as a captioned quote. Most readers understood he wasn't dodging legal action. He was refusing to reduce his experience into a familiar narrative, where personal tragedy becomes the easiest way to keep it outside the system. "There are right things that can't be concluded in a courtroom," Martin said in a brief interview afterward. "Some people want me to reclaim my honor, but I never lost it. I simply let the system see what it does to people who don't hold a title like mine." By refusing to sue, he didn't highlight personal harm. He pointed to something bigger, that real change only happens when the system examines itself, not under pressure, but by recognizing its reflection in the actions of those who wear the uniform. No lawsuit was filed, no court date set, but after that day, officer training programs added a new question to their ethics curriculum. How would you react if the person in front of you were the governor? And if not, would you react differently? That question, raised not by law, but by someone who chose not to use law for his justice, became the first real test of character for future officers. Not in court, but in the mirror every time they stepped outside in uniform. Martin Hayes's final public talk wasn't held in a government building, not on TV, and not organized by any official channel. It happened in a small community library on the city's edge, once a warehouse, now a shared learning space. The chairs formed a circle. No podium, no camera crew, just students, teachers, social workers, young officers, and a few veterans. Martin didn't bring a prepared speech. When invited to speak, he stood, folded the paper in his hand, and spoke calmly, like a conversation. "People ask why I didn't sue," he said. "Why didn't I take it to court? Let the law speak. Let a verdict close the chapter." He paused. "Because if I sue, it's just a case. Then he looked up and added, "But if I don't, it might become a lesson." The room went quiet. Pens stopped mid-sentence. A few looked up, surprised the answer could be so simple and so heavy. "A case ends in a verdict," he said, "but a lesson takes time. It asks people to look at the system they belong to, not to defend it, but to see themselves in it." One young person asked, "If you don't want to sue, don't want recognition, what do you want most?" Martin didn't answer right away. He looked down at his folded note, then said, clearly and without hesitation, "You don't have to remember my name. Just don't let it happen again to someone else." The silence in the room turned into understanding. Not admiration, but gratitude. Gratitude for someone who spoke up not to be heard, but so others wouldn't have to stay silent. After the talk, Martin left quietly through a side door. No crowd, no photos. A 12th grade student caught up to him and asked, "You don't want people to remember your name?" Martin smiled, placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and said, "They can remember it, but what matters is that when the next person is treated like I was, the one beside them shouldn't ask, 'Who are you?' but 'Why is this still happening?'" The boy nodded. Martin walked away, fading into the trees by the library, turning one act of harm into a quiet reckoning. No protest, no verdict, no monument. Because sometimes the one who makes the biggest impact isn't the one who starts the change, but the one who helps it stay long after the applause fades. And the questions others will keep asking: how do we treat each other when no one's filming? The march had no official organizers, no loudspeakers, no bright signs. There were no flyers, no hashtags. Word simply spread, and those who heard came on their own. On a cold Sunday morning, people began arriving on the street in front of the old police station. They came alone, not in groups, but all wore gray. Not shiny silver, not dark charcoal, but a quiet shade between anger and calm. No one spoke, no one smiled or nodded. They didn't need to. Being there was the message. Each held a black and white photo. No names, no captions, no dates. Just faces. The faces of people once stopped for looking out of place. A student who didn't return from buying bread. A woman searched at the library. Faces most had never seen because they never made headlines. Never spilled enough blood to matter. The silent line moved past the worn 3-story building, once a district command post, now under investigation for years of flawed reports. For the first time, people looked at it not with defiance, but with a kind of justice that doesn't need shouting. A 70-year-old woman walked with her grandson, holding a photo of a thin boy in a hoodie. She didn't explain, just said, "Hold it tight and keep walking." Students in gray walked together, each with a portrait, unfamiliar faces, all with the same look, seen as danger before being asked their names. Footsteps kept a slow rhythm, like breathing through memory. No one said why they came. They all knew. This wasn't a protest. It was how they marked history. Quietly, precisely. A white man near the end held a photo of someone being questioned on a sidewalk. He didn't say who, but his eyes showed shame. Maybe for years he thought he had nothing to do with it, until silence made him complicit. As the march turned down a side street, some children watched from across the road. One asked, "Why aren't they saying anything?" The mother said, "Because sometimes silence makes people hear better." By noon, they reached the lawn behind City Hall and slowly dispersed. No selfies, no live streams. Each person folded their photo, put it away, and walked off, not to forget, but to record. That day the city didn't call it a march. People used simpler words, taken from the quiet strength of those who came. They didn't come to make noise. They came so no one would forget. In the crowd, a girl about 8 walked beside her mother. Her curly hair was tied up, she wore sneakers on her feet, and in her hands she held a faded black and white photo. It wasn't large, but she gripped it tightly as if afraid it might blow away. The photo showed a middle-aged man in a simple shirt, smiling gently, as if caught mid-turn from his desk. His face was calm, with the trace of caution, like someone who knew a camera might capture what he could no longer say. A young reporter stood by the curb, camera over his shoulder, scribbling in a notebook. When he saw the girl, he didn't take a photo. He bent slightly and asked, "Do you know who that is?" She nodded, eyes fixed ahead. "My grandfather," she said. "I don't know why he was taken, just that he never came out of the station." Her mother stayed silent, didn't pull her close. Her lips were pressed tight, holding a memory she wouldn't let slip. No more words were needed. The girl's answer cut through the silence like nothing else could. There was no report with his name, no public record, no official remembrance. But the fact that his granddaughter stood there, holding his photo, while walking past the place he was once held, that alone brought truth back in a way no one could ignore. The crowd moved on, and her words began to echo. "Just that he never came out of the station." A man whispered to his son, "You hear that? That's what so many families lived with, and no one ever asked." The silence spread further than any chant, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real. Every step past the old station was a step of remembering. Not to name someone, but to stop them from being erased. At the final turn, high school students raised photos of people who had vanished or been detained without reason. They said nothing, but each photo asked the city the same thing. How many more will be silenced before something changes? The march ended in a small public square. No stage, no speeches. Just grass, old benches, and people who stayed a while longer, not out of grief, but because they knew this moment didn't need cameras. It needed to be remembered. Martin Hayes wasn't there. He didn't need to be. What mattered had already happened. People weren't asking, "Who was he?" anymore. They were asking, "Why did it happen, and how do we stop it from happening again?" And maybe it was that little girl with her grandfather's photo, not angry, just holding on, that did what speeches never could. She made the whole city pause and finally listen to what it had long tried to forget. The internal meeting between state representatives took place in an old conference room deep inside the Federal Executive Coordination Center, far from the usual centers of power. There was no media, no press, no cameras. The attendees were leaders in justice, law enforcement, and senior reform advisors, people who no longer spoke in slogans, but in the hard truths of a system long used to running on habit. There was no opening ceremony. The moderator, a Latina woman from New Mexico, simply said, "We're not here to defend what we once believed was right. We're here to begin again with one question: what should change first?" The room fell into a brief silence. An older man from Iowa raised his hand. He didn't speak at length, just said, "I propose the stop and suspicion order be rewritten. We can't keep letting officers detain people based only on professional instinct, without stating specific factors." A few nodded, some took notes, but a sharp voice cut in from the back. "No, that's not what needs to change first." The speaker was Trenton Ray, Director of Internal Training for the state of Illinois. He didn't stay seated. He stepped into the center of the room, eyes scanning the group, and added, "If we keep recruiting the same way, rewriting any rule is just decoration. The problem doesn't start with the wording, it starts with the people chosen to enforce it." Some froze, a few faces tightened, but no one objected. Trenton kept going, voice steady but firm. "You want stricter evidence to justify suspicion? I agree. But who's going to write in the report that someone avoided eye contact? Who decides if nervousness is suspicious or just a normal reaction to being stopped on the street?" He turned toward the legal advisors sitting near the back. "We've revised laws on the right to remain silent, on body cameras, on mandatory reporting, but how many in the field are still trained in a culture that teaches trust no one until they prove they're innocent?" The female inspector from Vermont spoke up. "It's both. Without clear rules, even good people can act wrongly. But if we don't change how enforcers are chosen, the law becomes an empty shell." The room grew louder, not from argument, but because everyone saw the problem ran deeper than high-level policy. It was rooted in who got into the academy, how psychological traits were screened, how reflexes were judged, and how behavior was taught. A representative from Oregon added, "We need new laws, but also a new way of shaping who wears the badge. Not everyone who wants to be a cop should be one." Trenton Ray nodded, softer than before. "We need people who see restraint as a foundation, not power as instinct." The moderator didn't conclude or ask for a vote. She simply asked, "If we start over, who should the system serve and who can be trusted to stop others on the street?" No one answered right away, but everyone knew. Without that answer, any reform would be surface level. The meeting had stretched past 3 hours. Arguments were solid, grounded in law and data. Ideas circled around laws, training, recruitment, and oversight. But the more solutions were raised, the more it felt unfocused, like rebuilding a house without deciding whether to tear it down or fix it floor by floor. Martin Hayes, sitting at the end of the table, hadn't spoken all morning. He hadn't interrupted or offered solutions. Everyone near him knew if he had something to say, he'd say it. Then, during a pause in debate, he looked up and said, "If everyone is right, then why does the wrong keep happening?" The room froze. Pens stopped. Keyboards stilled. The question wasn't aimed at anyone, but it hit what everyone had avoided. The system kept producing harm no one would claim. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. The silence shifted the tone. No more defending. People began reviewing their work, asking whether it truly prevented harm. And for the first time, people listened. Not out of formality, but because they had to. The Missouri delegate finally spoke. "I don't think we started wrong. I think we're scared this is our last chance to get it right." A woman from Colorado added, "I saw gaps in field assessments. I had the data, but I never asked the trainers why they still used broken methods." One by one, others spoke of things they'd seen, but couldn't stop, of reforms delayed or dismissed. No titles, no defensiveness, no votes. Just people who stayed because they knew leaving without honesty meant letting it all repeat. There was no speech, no slogan, just a single question that cracked the room open. If everyone is right, then why does the wrong keep happening? And with that, something finally shifted. Not policy, but courage. The kind needed to break cycles that survive on silence, disguised as certainty. On a quiet afternoon, with autumn sunlight spilling over porch roofs in a suburb east of the city, a boy named Liam, the one who once rode his bike past Martin Hayes and innocently asked, "Are you lost, sir?" sat on the couch holding a glass of milk, eyes fixed on the TV. For the first time, his mother let him watch the full video that had spread nationwide. Hayes was stopped and searched by 2 officers, then quietly stood up in the middle of the crowd. Liam said nothing at first. His face showed little emotion. He just watched how Hayes didn't resist, watched his calm, fearless stare into the camera, watched the crowd gather, the ID questioned, and finally how Hayes walked away without turning back. When the video ended, Liam turned to his mother. He sat closer, set his milk down, and asked softly, unsure if he should, "So, is he a good person? Then why did they do that?" His mother didn't respond right away. She clenched her hands, her eyes going still. It was clear she had prepared answers, but hearing the real question made words fall apart, because what Liam asked wasn't about law or procedure or anything found in a civics book. It was the kind of question a child asks when starting to see the gap between action and character, between truth and what adults choose to ignore. At last, she simply shook her head, held him close, and said, "Tonight, I don't know how to answer, but thank you for asking." The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, she found Liam outside. He was carefully writing with a marker on a white cardboard sheet, the kind used for school science fairs. When he finished, he quietly taped the sign to the fence near their walkway, where everyone walking by could see it. The sign wasn't large, but the words were clear. Don't look at someone with suspicion before you say hello. No one told him what to write. No one asked him to speak up. But somehow the question from the night before didn't fade. It was answered in the only way a child knows, by turning confusion into something simple, visible, and his own. The first neighbor to pass the sign was Mr. Peterson, a retired veteran who walked his dog every morning. He stopped, read the message, glanced at the half-closed door, and smiled faintly. He didn't knock. He just nodded once and kept walking, as if reminded of a responsibility he'd left behind somewhere. In the days that followed, others stopped too. No one tore the sign down. No one mocked it. A couple of Asian American neighbors added a note beside it that read, "Thank you for writing what many adults are afraid to say." When asked why he wrote it, Liam gave no big answer, just said, quietly and unsure, Because I don't know who's good if I haven't said hello yet. Martin Hayes didn't hear about it right away. Nearly a week passed before someone snapped a photo of the sign and posted it online with the caption, "A Child's First Lesson in Justice," written by an 8-year-old. That photo eventually made its way to Martin's desk. He didn't repost it, he didn't call, he didn't send a thank you letter. But during a closed meeting on statewide policing reform, he took out the photo and placed it at the center of the table. He said, "We can't fix every past mistake, but we can build a future where a child never has to ask that question again." The room went quiet, not because of policy, but because of a boy who once asked, "Are you lost?" and was now learning how to make sure others wouldn't feel lost in the face of judgment. 3 days after a small sign appeared on Liam's fence, a local reporter, Penelope Wright, stopped by. She didn't bring cameras or ask for interviews. She read the sign slowly, then exhaled, as if something had just clicked. When Liam's mother came out, Penelope asked to take a photo. One of the fence, one of a smaller note pinned below. "Some things don't need to be loud, just on time." She asked gently who wrote it. Liam stood inside, watching. When he came out, Penelope asked, "Did you write it?" He nodded, then looked down. "Do you want a photo with it?" He shook his head. "I don't want to be in the news." She nodded, then asked, "Who did you write it for?" Liam looked up at the sign, then said, "I just hoped someone would see it and do the same." That was enough. The sign stayed. Neighbors began to notice it, and each other. Penelope wrote a small piece for page 2. No names, no photo. Just the line, "Don't look at someone with suspicion before you say hello." It spread more than the weekend news. Not for debate, just one shared feeling. I want to teach my child that too. A school asked to display the sign. Liam's mother declined. It belongs here, where people forget to look. One day, Martin Hayes passed by. No title, no speech, just a man reading a child's words, bowing slightly, then walking on. The sign remains, worn by rain, taped again and again, not for display, but to hold its meaning. A small act by someone unknown can remind others to stop, see clearly, and choose not to ignore what matters. The party leadership's closed meeting took place in a traditional wood-paneled room on the 8th floor of headquarters in the Capitol. As each election nears, this room becomes the center of decisions that shape the nation's political future. But this time, no one spoke of rivals or media strategy. Every eye was on the man seated at the end of the table, Martin Hayes. Since the incident on Charlesworth Street, his reputation had grown beyond the role of a state governor. Internal polls ranked him among the most trusted figures nationwide, not just for clear policies, but for his calm manner and refusal to exploit public attention. It was exactly that integrity that made his party believe he could break the deadlock between factions. The head of the campaign committee spoke plainly. "Martin, this is your moment. We need someone with ideals, yes, but also lived experience, rooted in the very crises the system is facing." Martin listened. His face didn't soften or harden. He looked as if the conversation wasn't about him, but about a duty waiting for someone to carry it. But when the last speaker finished, he didn't hesitate. "I appreciate the offer," he said, "but I decline." The room paused. Some expected him to ask for time or make conditions. Instead, he repeated, "I don't want to run for president." A senior advisor asked, almost disbelieving, "You could reshape national politics, why not?" Martin met his eyes, answering slowly, each word meant to stay, "I don't want my story turned into a campaign." His voice held no anger, no sarcasm, only the clarity of someone who knows what must remain untouched. "What happened to me wasn't a victory," he added. "It was a crack, and I won't let anyone build something new on that crack just to forget why it appeared in the first place." The meeting ended early. Some were disappointed, others stayed quiet, but no one tried to convince him again. They knew Martin Hayes wasn't the kind of man to change his mind just because the door was open. Days later, news of his refusal spread in the form of a short statement. No long reasoning, no strategic breakdown, just one line. "My story is not a tool to build an image, It is a reminder that the image should never matter more than the person. While public debate still swirled, a well-known author, famous for writing biographies of major political figures, requested a private meeting with Martin to write a book. He said he wanted to capture a crucial moment in American history through the lens of someone who walked through the crack without falling. Martin declined directly. "I don't oppose others' writing," he replied in a short email, "but I won't add anything beyond what I've already chosen to make public." The author wasn't offended. In a later piece, he wrote, "Perhaps Martin Hayes doesn't fear being misunderstood. He just doesn't want the silence he once held to be replaced by someone else's voice. And so the story of a man who once stood before the invisible barrel of bias and chose not to strike back with power remained unfilmed, unwritten, unbranded. It stayed where it began, in the eyes of a child who asked, 'Are you lost?' on a small sign that read, 'Don't look at someone with suspicion before you say hello,' and in quiet rooms where old questions are asked again with new honesty." A month after Martin turned down both a presidential run and a personal biography, the governor's office made a quiet move. No press, no statement. Just a small ivory card, palm-sized, sent to everyone, named or not, who had appeared in records of systemic misconduct over the past 10 years. Each card held one single sentence in clean, round type. "This story isn't about me. It's about how someone, anyone, can stand still without turning away." A plain envelope, slipped into mailboxes, under doors, or passed through hands, with one hope, that those once stopped, doubted, or judged might know their silence had been heard. An elderly woman on the city's west side, once held at a market on suspicion of stealing bread without proof, received hers one early morning. She read the line, folded the paper, and placed it on her husband's altar. Not because he'd been wrongly accused, but because he was the only one who believed she never needed to explain herself that day. A college student, stopped 3 times in 1 month for matching the vague description, gray hoodie, medium skin, no backpack, got one too. He didn't tell anyone. He taped it to his laptop lid, and every time he opened it, he read the line again. Not to dwell on injustice, but to remember he hadn't been forgotten. In a northern town, where a man died hours after being held without explanation, his mother received the same card. Her son had once written in his journal, "No one stands with me, but I don't want to become anyone's enemy." She read the line and pressed her hand to her chest. "You were right," she said. Martin Hayes never appeared alongside those cards. No source was confirmed. But most recipients understood. If he had something to say, that was it. One criminal justice professor showed the card to his students during class. No essay, no lecture, just a question. "Have you ever thought about standing still, not to stay neutral, but to keep someone else from being swallowed by bias?" A student, daughter of a police officer, whispered through tears, "I never thought my father could be wrong, but maybe, if someone had told him this sooner, he would have stood still a little longer." In the weeks after, more cards appeared, photocopied, handwritten, reprinted, on library windows, grocery store doors, and light poles near schools. No credits, no names, but anyone who stopped to read them softened, like the words had touched something ignored for too long. When asked at a town hall if he had sent them, Martin simply smiled and said, "If those words reached someone, then my name doesn't matter." Then he left, as always, without fanfare, without applause, because for him, what mattered wasn't leaving a mark, but creating a quiet space where others might finally choose to stand and not look away. In the latest edition of the National Civics textbook, piloted in over 30 high schools across the country, a new chapter appears at the end, titled, "What would you do if you saw something wrong?" It doesn't begin with definitions, list rules, or assign points. Instead, it opens with a series of brief but unsettling scenarios, written as if they happened just yesterday, right outside the school gates or in the street. Someone is stopped for not looking like a local. A student is searched at the school entrance without a clear reason. A person in a wheelchair is asked to leave the safe zone to make others uncomfortable. Each case is just a few lines long, without names, details, or conclusions. Below each is a blank space and a single question. If you were standing there, what would you do? There are no hints about the right response. The goal isn't memorization. It's for students to put themselves, maybe for the first time, in the place of a witness, not the hero, not the victim, but someone close enough to see, far enough to choose. Some write that they would step in, some say they would record it, others admit they would freeze, hesitate, or back away. A few write only one sentence. I don't know. That answer, I don't know, is what the curriculum team calls the most honest beginning, because the point isn't a perfect reaction, it's knowing that there was a choice at all. And from that, understanding that silence is a choice too, with consequences as real as action. This new chapter doesn't teach students how to be heroes. It simply asks, if you see something wrong, will you stay still to avoid it or stay present so someone doesn't face it alone? That morning, a civics class in a suburban public high school was quiet. The teacher carried graded papers. The students opened their books to the new chapter. Sunlight crossed the chalkboard, streaking faint lines like old marks not yet erased. No one noticed the man entering the room, wearing a brown jacket, hair neatly gray. His name had been in every national headline for a year. Martin Hayes stood at the back of the room, watching in silence. The teacher smiled and said, "Today, we have a guest who just wants to listen. Not to grade you, just to hear." The students continued. Each read a scenario, then wrote their response. Some filled paragraphs. Some wrote just a few words. Some tapped their pens, trying to write what had never been taught. Martin didn't walk around. He stood still, hands folded, eyes on every student. No one recognized him right away. He didn't want them to. He only wanted to see how a new generation learns to respond. Not through theory, but through the first words of awareness. When a girl stood to read her answer aloud, Martin tilted his head slightly. Her voice was clear and steady. "If I saw someone being stopped without being asked anything, I wouldn't walk away. I don't know if I'd be brave enough to step in, but I'd want that person to know they're not alone." The room stayed quiet. No one clapped. But Martin's gaze softened, as if what he came to find wasn't the perfect answer, but the simple truth. "I don't know what I'll do, but I won't look away." Just before the class ended, Martin quietly turned and walked out. A student near the door suddenly looked up. He said nothing. He simply looked at Martin and nodded. A slow, deliberate nod that made it clear this wasn't random. Martin looked back. He nodded too, a quiet sign between two people who understood each other. And that was enough, because some things don't need to be named to be seen. Some lessons don't need a lectern to be remembered. And sometimes a single nod is all it takes to say that silence, when it comes at the right moment, can be an act in itself. After the video showing Martin Hayes being stopped in the street, not for any violation but for not looking like a local, spread across social media platforms, an old silence began to crack. Small stories followed, scattered and painfully honest. Each one spoke of a moment when someone was stopped without explanation, had their pocket touched without consent, or was asked, "Do you live here?" right in front of their own home. A mother sent a letter to the governor's office. No exclamation marks, just line after line describing how her son, 16 at the time, was once pinned to the sidewalk outside a pharmacy because he matched a suspect's description. He didn't resist, but from that day on, he never again looked a police officer in the eye. A library worker recalled arriving early to set up a reading room, only to be questioned for 15 minutes because he was the only black man in the neighborhood. He smiled thinly as he said, "I don't blame them. I just wish once they'd ask my name before asking why I'm here." A former student sent in a copy of his final report card where he'd been marked for resisting authority after asking a simple question, "Why are you detaining me?" It was a basic question, but in that system, It was enough to be recorded. Public pressure grew by the day. Each post carried thousands of comments, not to argue, but to add to a picture that had seemed complete, but had never been fully seen. Petitions flooded city halls, police departments, school boards, and human rights commissions. People no longer spoke only about Martin Hayes. They began to ask, what about those without cameras? The ones who were never recorded, what about them? On the 10th day, the police department released an official statement. The 2 officers involved in the incident were permanently dismissed, citing serious violations of conduct standards during duty. This was not the result of a lawsuit or media pressure. It came from a chain reaction no one ordered, no one coordinated, no one controlled, a form of justice rising from the ground up, shaped by quiet stories and direct gazes at the truth. And what about Martin Hayes? He accepted no form of recognition. When a city proposed renaming a park in his honor, he declined. I didn't do anything to be celebrated. I just want people to hold on to what's called justice. The only thing he allowed was an official channel where anyone, regardless of title, lawyer, or documents, could share what they had experienced. A space to preserve things once dismissed as too small to matter. A space where, as he put it, justice can begin when people are allowed to speak. Because its purpose was not to decide who is right or wrong, but to show that in a system that only responds when someone has power, a camera, or public attention, silence can no longer be treated as a safe option. The story didn't end with a trial, an election, or a speech. It ended with a community learning how to listen, not to judge, but to understand. And it began again with a child writing a small sign. Don't look at someone with suspicion before you say hello. It wasn't a law, it was a reminder that respect doesn't start with rules, it starts with how we look at each other. And if there's a lesson to close this entire story, it's this. No system, no matter how big, can stand if the people inside it start to look directly at what they once avoided. And when one person dares to stand still instead of turning away, the next will know they're not alone. There is no holiday bearing his name on the official state calendar, but in quiet classrooms, where students are beginning to ask questions instead of memorizing answers, and in neighborhoods that once stayed silent in the face of injustice but now paused to look more closely, the name Martin Hayes remains not on signs, but in how people are learning to stand beside one another again. He left no legacy of fame. He left a space so those once silenced could speak, and those once doubted could walk without needing to explain. Because he believed justice is not granted from above, but begins when an ordinary person chooses not to look away, even if no one asks them to, no one stands with them, and there is no guarantee they will be believed. And sometimes, as he once said, one person is enough to make what's right not arrive too late.